back to Eschatology Matters. I am Josh Howard, and I want to remind you, if you've not already, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. You can keep up with all the content that's coming out, and we also encourage you to check out the website, which is eschatologymatters.org. You can find all of our content is at least linked, if not listed, there on the website, and you can also check out things about our conference schedule. I think by the time this interview airs, the conference for 2023 will be over, but you can check out what's coming up in 2024 and whatever else we have in the works. We also have membership tiers that gives you advanced access to most of the things we have coming out, as well as some more direct access to the speakers and contributors that we have on Eschatology Matters. But I want to get right down to today. I've been looking forward to this interview greatly. I'm joined today by John Harris. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on, Joshua. Looking forward to whatever we get into.
Absolutely. John, if anybody's unfamiliar with you, would you mind just giving them a kind of quick bio rundown on who you are and what you're up to?
Sure. Most people probably online at least know me from my podcast and from maybe some of the books that I've written on social justice. I wrote in 2019, I came out with a book called Social Justice Goes to Church, which described really what we were seeing at the time. This is pre-2020 and what we saw in full display in 2020. And I just traced the historical development of that from the New Left of the 1960s to the present. And then I wrote another book, Christianity and Social Justice, Religions and Conflict. And it was in the spirit of J. Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism. And I just showed how social justice is a religion antithetical to Christianity. And those are some materials that I put out there to help people. There's even a workbook with that particular book for small groups. And I just didn't see other ministries producing materials that were helpful on this. The few books that did come out were more delayed, and most of them were just not great. And so anyway, it was really, I think, for me, it wasn't like I really wanted to tackle these subjects. In fact, most people don't know this, but I don't really like talking about this. I don't like researching it, but I enjoy certain aspects of research, but the topic isn't that interesting to me. Like there's other periods of history that I like studying, and hobbies and things that I'd love to. But this is a need, and there aren't people really, a lot of people, at least at the time I started, that were shining a spotlight on it and explaining it, refuting it. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I started the podcast 2019, January, I guess, somewhere in there. And I was a graduate of Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I saw social justice kind of take over the campus while I was there. And then I was at Liberty University. I even saw it making some inroads in certain areas there, though I really do love Liberty. I just decided to speak out, and one thing led to another. So that's kind of my online imprint, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I view myself as a normal guy. I'm involved at my church. I'm in music ministry. I'm smoking some meat right now. That's what I like to do. And I love outdoor sports. So yeah.
Yeah, you talk a lot about smoking meat on your podcast. I've noticed. I always get hungry when I listen to you. But
well, if you smelled what I'm smelling, you would definitely be hungry.
And you also, I want to mention, our friend Tim Bashong has is it the 4th Jesus and Politics conference that you're one of the speakers at, I believe?
I've been there twice, so this is my 3rd. I think he had one though before me, so this is his 4th. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, and that's October 21st in Syracuse, Indiana. I think we've got that
right
that listed up on our website as well.
Yep.
But yeah, today, John, I wanted to get into a little bit about what's not too far removed from Jesus and politics, I suppose, just sort of that general intersection of Christianity and politics, Christianity and social structure. But specifically, one of the things that's been making a lot of waves lately has been Christian nationalism. And I know even bringing up Christian nationalism may be a bit it may feel like that conversation has been had, but just judging from a lot of the things that I've seen written and a lot of the conversations, I'm not so sure there's a lot of understanding or definition happening with that conversation. So I was hoping you could speak about that and maybe what some of its parameters are. When you hear that term Christian nationalist, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've heard you describe yourself as a Christian nationalist, but I think I've heard you speak to Christian nationalism. But just walk us into that a little bit, John, how you view this movement, what you see as some of its parameters, some of its, some of the guardrails that are within this, or maybe a lack of guardrails. But what's your take on this, and what's your association with that?
Well, yeah, some people on Twitter think my association is I'm at the heart of the movement or something. I actually have never taken the label. I don't particularly care for the label. I've explained that before on the podcast, why that is. For me, it has to do with a historical thing that that term was used a little over 100 years ago to describe socialist groups in the United States. And so they're trying to market Fabian socialism to a Christian audience. But, it's sorry, my barbecue thing is going off here and distracting me and telling me that my meat is too, I got to get rid of this. Those are the problems that I have during the day. All right. So back to Christian nationalism. I just don't like that association. There was these groups called Bellamy clubs. There was hundreds of them, and they use that term to market Fabian socialism to an American audience. So they wanted to have a living wage and free healthcare and all kinds of socialist things. And they wanted to do it in a patriotic kind of way, or at least that with that veneer. So same time as the social gospel, really, maybe just before it. And so, the Christian nationalism of today does not represent that, really. There is no link between the two other than the title. But I think because I'm a history guy, I don't know. I don't really particularly care for the name because of the precedent in history. But I think the concepts today that are being reintroduced under the banner of Christian nationalism are varied. And that's why it's a little hard to pin them down. That's why I think doing a whole podcast on trying to cram it into an ideological framework is a big mistake, because whatever version you critique or promote, it's not going to describe everyone who's using that label. Most likely. There are some commonalities, I believe, but they're very general, and they're not something that you could spend. We could spend a lot of time, I suppose, talking about them, but as far as describing them, it doesn't really take that long. Basically, what I think all the iterations of Christian nationalism have in common is a respect for not just a Christian value system, but a Christian identity. So we've gotten away not just from Christian values, but we've gotten away from thinking of ourselves as a Christian country. And so we need to return somehow to considering ourselves, viewing ourselves as Christian. And then that will help us also make the argument that we should have Christian values once we see ourselves that way. That's, I think, what all of the Christian nationalist movements have in common. Now, there are variations. You have like Stephen Wolfe's version, which is really a paleoconservatism repackaged. You have Andrew Torba's version, which is more working class, but I see like little hints of theonomy and things like that in his. You have the Statement on Christian Nationalism by a bunch of guys, Joel Webben and Dusty Devers, and then there's a bunch of people behind that. And that also, I think, carries with it some theonomic undertones, and a lot of those guys are post-mill, but they don't explicitly say you have to be post-mill. Some people have tried to claim that that's what it is going on there, but they all have a different flavor a little bit, and we can explore those if you'd like. But I think that theonomy and paleoconservatism are ideas that have been around for a while, and or I shouldn't even say ideas, really, because paleoconservatism is more of an approach and a posture, but these movements have been around for a while, and it's not like they're anything new. In fact, I texted a friend of mine, Bill Roach. I haven't looked at. Apparently, he did a speech. I don't know if it's out yet, where he critiqued Christian nationalism. He's a philosopher. He endorsed my last book, and he's convinced, I guess, there's some kind of a tie with Hegel here and Christian nationalists. And I asked him. I said, did we think that theonomy was Hegelian, or did we think that paleoconservatism was Hegelian? I mean, I never heard those critiques, but all of a sudden, all you do is slap a new label on it, and now it becomes power-seeking Hegelian. So, I think a lot of it is the media has made it a boogeyman, and you have a group of Christians who have said, you know what, they call us deplorables. Maybe we are deplorables. They said that we believe fake news. You're fake news. Like, they took all these terms that the media used and then just turned the cannons around right on the media. And that same thing's happening here. And so there's a rhetorical strategy that's being used to introduce some ideas that have been around for a while, older ideas, back into Christian political thought that have been forgotten, some of them, or they've been sidelined. So that's what I think is going on. I don't think it should get all the attention and get the amount of negative reactions that we've seen, especially from Christian ministries. Most of the critiques I've seen have been either misunderstandings or accepting the media's narrative, or just lazy critiques, not really just like cherry picking maybe some things, but not actually trying to read in context what Stephen Wolfe or Andrew Torb is saying. So yeah, that's I think where we are. It's a sad state of affairs. If we were reasonable and we could talk to each other, I don't think we'd have this problem. But we do have a problem right now. And Christian nationalism isn't really what's causing the division. It's the reaction to it that I think is causing the division. So that's my take.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And part of the reason I asked it that way, and I'm glad you walked us into it that way, John, because a lot of the people that watch this channel, we want this to be kind of an invitation into specifically eschatological thought. But for the person in the pew, this is kind of an invitation into some of these themes. And this is one of those themes right now that I think has a lot of people very confused. You have, you mentioned a lot of the reaction against Christian nationalism. I think that's what's caught a lot of my eye, is that everything becomes Christian nationalism. And so all of a sudden you start seeing things like theonomy or postmillennialism or these other movements that are very old and have very different iterations. And there's different, Bonson is not Rushdoony and Rushdoony is not Gary North, et cetera.
Sure.
So you've got these different voices within these movements, but they mention the state, or they mention the nation bowing the knee to Christ, or the fact that, a nation should in some form or fashion identify itself as a Christian entity, and everything gets lumped into Christian nationalism, which is a bit troubling when you have voices which don't even claim to be necessarily Christian, which are getting lumped into this Christian nationalist movement. It's quite interesting to see some of the pushback against it that seems to define it, because as best as I can tell, Christian nationalism is oftentimes regarded as any belief where the nations can be judged, or the nations can submit to Christ, or the nations in any form or fashion are supposed to claim a Christian identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It really isn't much more complicated than that. The Christians should, when they are elected to public office, operate as Christians. People, even those who are not Christians, should respect Christian laws. It's been traditional in European countries, and America is included in this, and so are other English-speaking countries and other colonial powers that I guess exist in other parts of the world, that Christianity is part of the identity or the fabric of that country's moral system. They're not just in their laws, but in their public mores, how they view something like public displays of affection, even, and homosexual displays within that, and how to treat children, how to treat ladies, and do you give up your seat? All of these things really were tied in with a Christian understanding of how we conduct ourselves. And so people who weren't even Christians were able to recognize some of this and operate accordingly, even if they didn't have the heart that honored Christ. There were still some outward actions that were better for society and better for the Christians living in society. And that's been cast asunder. That's been a lot of the modern Christians who have any kind of a platform think that that's a compromise, and think that we ought to just strictly have a separation between the church, and this is at least how they conceive of it, between the church and the world, in such a way that there is no confusion between the two. And I sympathize with this to an extent, because I don't think we should confuse between the two. But the world system, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, boastful pride of life, I mean, that I don't view that as synonymous with culture. I don't view that, and that's one of the things that you often hear. Some of these guys will make that synonymous. They'll treat culture and the world as if they're the same thing, and they're simply not. I think a good example to bring up would be Old Testament Israel and all the things that they were expected to keep. It didn't matter if their hearts were in the right place. This was the law that they were expected to keep, right? So are there wheat among the tares? Is there some confusion that's inevitable? You're always going to have that. You can't know someone's heart. There's a lot of people in churches today that I would say are solid churches that aren't saved, and they act like it. You can't filter all hypocrisy out. That's impossible. But even if someone's being a hypocrite, we would prefer that they're a hypocrite in such a way that they're keeping God's law as much as possible, right? That's better. And see, that what I'm already saying is controversial in the minds of some modern elite Christians who have seemed to have adopted maybe a more of an Anabaptist outlook on this whole subject. Maybe, I don't know if that's the main influence or if it's something else. But that's one of the sticking points, is that they're against cultural Christianity. They don't think that Christians should pursue that.
Yeah. And then we just had a really fascinating conversation with an Irish pastor named Jamie Bambrick, and he had a kind of viral video on cultural Christianity. I would commend that video to everybody. But tell me this, because something you said a minute ago, I think is interesting. When you were laying this out at the beginning, you said there's a difference between a moral system and an identification as such. And I wonder, do you see, maybe is that where the tension lies? Because what you just described, we could just generally classify what you described as the second use of the law, right? This is the common restraint of evil and the promotion of the good.
That's right.
And that's been within, especially within Reformed Christianity, that's been around for a long time. Is it just so I don't think, well, I would hope that most people would not hear that it is good to have Christian morality legislated, that is better for mankind to live with the laws that the Creator has established. Maybe
Sure.
not as much pushback on that. Is it where the identification comes in that you're seeing the conflict or the pushback?
Yeah, that's one of there's a few points of conflict, but that is definitely one of them. Yeah, because some of these guys, I would say, even I think like the G3 guys who have written articles against Christian nationalism will say things like, but I'm pro-life, or I'm an abortion abolitionist, or I'm for a strict border policy and that kind of thing. And so they'll import these Christian values and say that, I'm not critiquing that, but then they will blast Christian nationalists for thinking cultural Christianity is somehow positive and wanting to promote that, or wanting to use state power, let's say, to create blasphemy laws, or to favor Christianity in some official capacity. That's and they think that's un-American. They think so. There is tension. I don't know if they all see it, but there is a lot of tension in their thinking on this, because on the one hand, they want a neutrality, and they want within that neutrality somehow Christian values to, I guess, compete and win, so the people are convinced in their hearts that, and they convert and they adopt Christian values and Christian. They sort of want some Christian policies. But only if it's in this neutral setting. And that means that the state can't like directly honor a certain church or Christianity as such. They can't privilege it. They can't give it a status where people who blaspheme against it are going to prison or getting in trouble in some way, or, a fine, whatever. Like, so it creates this problem, because if you're a free speech absolutist, or you think that that's which we could talk about that if you want. I don't want to go in too much of a different direction, but this is just a good, I think, example to use. If you think that free speech includes, whatever you want to say, and that any law that would restrict someone's speech is fundamentally anti-American, and on that basis, I guess it's just morally wrong, you are importing a new standard in a way. Like you are committed to a framework, but it's not a Christian framework. And that's part of the problem, is that we expect Christian results, but without a Christian foundation. And so you're going to have pornography, right? If you're a free speech absolutist, you're going to have all kinds of horrible things. And what we found, I think, is that kind of neutrality, that classical liberal neutrality, is just a transitional phase. It can't actually last. It's an unstable element. Right now, we have blasphemy laws. We have people who are in prison right now because they desecrated, supposedly, or burned pride flags, or it carries with it a greater punishment than burning an American flag. Why is that? Well, it's because it's about a protected class. That is equivalent to a blasphemy law. You're not allowed to oppose, or at least if you do oppose, the punishments will be stronger for opposing a group that's a protected class from the government. So we already have that. And Christian nationalists are saying we don't want to get back to a place of neutrality. We don't think principled pluralism works, where, well, homosexuals can do their thing, and transgender people can groom kids, and they can be loud in the public square, and then Christians can also be loud in the public square, and somehow we're going to have peace. Like, that's not possible. In fact, what Christian nationalists, I think all iterations are saying, is we need to favor Christianity. So there's no problem with making pornography illegal. There's no problem with making drag queen story hour illegal in your town. There's no problem with saying that people, are fined. I don't know if I've heard anyone actually say this, but I think the logic would lend itself to this if they blaspheme Christ. And there were laws on the books like that at the founding of this country. So it's not out of step with the founding, but it is out of step with this classical liberal conception that has replaced the founding, that I would say between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement kind of came into effect. So that is one of the sticking points.
So tell me this, John, because I don't want to rush to the end, but this was one of my latter questions, but you're kind of jumping into it now. Is this, in your estimation, is the opposition or reaction against some of the more mainstream iterations of Christian nationalism? And I'm trying to frame that correctly, right? We could find outliers. We can all find people on the fringes that are saying things that we would not agree with. But in general, do you take the reaction against this to really be a reaction against the disintegration of classical liberalism? And let me frame what I mean. One of the kind of illustrations that we've used here is, it seems that what a lot of people are grappling with right now, specifically within Western culture, is that there was a ship and it was sailing along quite fine, and at some point somebody started disassembling the ship, right? Boards started missing and water starts gushing in, and so there was a time at which that ship's cruising along and it still seems to be functioning, and that seems to be what you're describing as that myth of neutrality. We're still kind of steaming along, but there's water pouring in, so it's not a tenable situation. At some point it's going to unravel. Well, now we're starting to float on boards, the kind of detritus of the shipwreck, and we're trying to figure out what happened with that ship. Is this just a pushback against classic liberalism?
Christian nationalism? Sure. It's not, but it's not the only one, right? So you have Christian nationalism, you have this foundationalism idea, that series of ideas that Charles Hayward has. You have a return of paleoconservatism. You have even some of the more we would consider, I suppose, fringy elements like Kinism, and so, which has been around, I guess, for a few decades, if I'm not mistaken. But things like that are even coming back. I even see on I guess you could say the political right. There's even there are like some of the things that people say that like Christian nationalists are fascistic. It's kind of ridiculous. But the truth is, there are young men who are starting to consider things like fascism. I don't think it's in great numbers, fascism specifically. I think it's still a boogeyman, but it's the more that it's treated like everything becomes fascism, and the more it's talked about and identified as the enemy by people who on their watch have allowed debauchery to take place, it's going to gain in popularity over time. And so there's all these outside the box kind of political solutions that are, I suppose, competing. People are trying to figure out, where did we go wrong? Something's wrong. Where was it? And they know they've been lied to. So I think it started with 2020. I think it started with COVID. It started with the BLM stuff. But now it's just gotten into all kinds of areas. People are wondering if any of the history they've been told is real. They're starting to go out on their own. And so this freaks out people who are establishment, because they're all kind of in a guild by themselves. It doesn't matter if you're at the top of the political world, you're going to have something in common with someone at the top of the entertainment world, at the top of these various industries, of the business world. They share more in common with each other than they do the people in their industries on lower levels. That's the managerial elite theory. And so all managerial elites, you have to view it this way. They all live in a different bubble than the rest of us, where I would say endorsements and respect and accolades are your bread and butter. And you need that from other people of a like status or higher status. And so you're always looking for that. And the elites have determined that this is very bad, right? All these things that are questioning their authority are very bad. Very bad for who? For them. So that's why you have, I think, a circle the wagons kind of thing, and just the irrational knee-jerk reactions that Christian nationalism is this or that, and frothing at the mouth while people say it. It's not rational. It's not I've not seen, and I've read the vast majority of critiques of Stephen's book, major critiques. I've read probably 6 or 7 of them. I haven't seen one that I thought was fair yet. There's one I haven't read. Stephen told me was somewhat fair that I need to read, but most of them are just cheap shots. They're not serious. And that's what I attribute it to, because they have to come up with a paradigm that makes sense of this. And there aren't many. Like, you could say people are, they're evil, or they're ignorant, or that, there's some kind of a vested interest here. And I think the vested interest makes the most sense. It's the simplest explanation in my head, at least. So,
so what of the critique and the pushback because like you said, there's different movements swirling around. You know, Christian nationalism is not the same as theonomy, nor is it the same as paleoconservatism. We could dice up some of those categories, but in general, there's been a frequent critique of Christian nationalism that it sniffs a bit of, at best, ethnocentrism is how it's been phrased. At worst,
Yeah.
it's been white Christian nationalism, as if this is just a purely ethnic or racially motivated movement. Why
Yep.
is that the critique? Is it a fair critique in your estimation? What's going on with that?
That's more of a critique of paleoconservatism, actually. It's not so much. So this battle was already fought. That's why I think a lot of the Christian leaders right now don't even know that this battle was fought. They're ignorant of it, and they're refighting the same battles, stepping into the same traps. This is what Pat Buchanan was smeared for. This happened in the 90s, the 70s through the 90s, as you saw National Review purging actual conservatives from being writers in their magazine. Dinesh D'Souza was part of some of this, trying to expose people like Sam Francis and others. And I think that the thing that paleoconservatives have always believed, and paleo just means old. I mean, it's a term coined by Tom Fleming and Paul Gottfried in like the 80s, but they were trying to make it a separation between their conservatism and then neoconservatives, people who were committed to the proposition nation and universalism or globalism of some variety, and then realized that the Democrats couldn't do math, and so they came over to the Republican side and they started influencing Republican and conservative politics. And so they had to figure out a way, like, how do we make a distinction here between us? And so there was a book written by Tom Fleming and Paul Gottfried where they laid some of this out, but without going into all the details, basically on this particular point, paleoconservatisms, if you opened up National Review in the 1950s, when it still had a lot of paleoconservatives, it would have critiqued the Nazis. But the way that they critiqued the Nazis was, this is ideology, this is racially derived ideology, but it's totalitarian ideology. Their critiques would have been very similar to their critiques of the Soviet Union. So they're very opposed to Nazism. The left at that time, though, was saying that actually the problem with Nazism is they just love their people in place too much. So blood and soil to the paleoconservatives was a meaningless slogan. Hitler claimed to love his people, but he jailed them. But he violated the borders of other nations. But he, killed, many, not just Jewish people, in the Holocaust, and everything was sacrificed for an ideology. He was in love with ideas in his head, not people. And that was a conservative critique of Nazism and fascism, that these are ideologies. And of course, because the left, they are ideological, they found a different critique. And so conservatives were saying the problem is they don't love their people in place enough. And the liberals are saying, no, the problem is they love their people in place. Fast forward to 2023, where we are now, this gradual shift that took place over time. Now today's right, supposedly, is echoing the same exact things the left said in the 50s. They're using Adorno's F scale. Adorno was a Frankfurt School guy who came up with this F scale, that if you love your country or your parents too much, like you're a little bit of a fascist, and psychologists used it. And I mean, Harry Truman in the 1950s, he accused Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 of harboring Nazi sympathies because of his anti-communism, because of the fact that the Republicans had been against jobs programs, and that meant that during World War II that they were more in favor of cutting a deal with Hitler, and so there was this economic component. There was an anti, I guess, mass immigration component as well. And so, Truman, you could read his speeches. I mean, he just sounds like he's a Democrat from 2023. There's no difference. He just accuses the other side of being Nazis. And Dwight Eisenhower defeated the Nazis, but again, he's a proto-Nazi. That critique didn't work so well in 1952. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower won in a landslide. It does work today, and it's not just on the left, it's on the right. And so that is, I think, that captures some of the differences there, and why there's this knee-jerk reaction against paleoconservatives and those who would use the title Christian nationalists to support their paleoconservatism, because they believe that we are an actual people. Donald Trump believed this too. We're an actual people with borders in a particular place, and you can't America's not an idea. You can't just go plant it in the desert of Iraq and expect America to blossom. No, there's particular conditions that have taken place over time, that have developed, that have created the situation where we were able to have the freedoms that we have. They're not universal. Now, you could even say some of these things are universal freedoms, but they can only work in a setting where, I mean, the founders pretty much all believe this, most of them, I would say, if not all, that you had to have Christianity, you had to have morality, you had to have a people that were bound together through ties of kinship and common law tradition and language, that without these things, you don't have public trust. And so one of those things is religion. One of those things is Christianity. And we're to the point now where that's the last thing we have, because we have imported so many people from so many places, whether legally or illegally. We already have a problem with public trust in that area. It takes centuries to develop public trust with people who are different through intermarriage and other things. And that process has not happened gradually. It's happened very instantly. And then you have now different languages. You go to Southern California, where I'm from originally, and so many of the places you go, they don't even speak English. Try getting a McDonald's burger in Los Angeles, and it's almost like you have to know Spanish. And so it's changing. There's areas in Michigan that are Muslim, and now they are codifying in law, letting Muslims have their public prayer calls and so forth, and it's not violating any noise ordinance. This is happening, and we don't seem to have anything that ties us together. And I think there's a last desperate attempt here to say, what about Christianity? We all kind of have that, right? Like 70-something% of Americans say they're Christian or Catholic. Can that be the glue that allows us to have public trust again? And I would submit that that's the only move that we have right now, really, the only practical move. And the only hope. Apart from that, the only thing that's going to bind Americans together is going to be a totalitarian government forcing them together, because they don't want to be together. The left coast does not want to be in the same country as Alabama and Wisconsin, right? There's just such a division right now. This is kind of late stage empire decaying stuff, and whatever rises from the ashes is what we need to be preparing for.
No, that's really interesting. So help me out with this, John. So I'm thinking through everything you just said. I think identity has a lot to do with it, the identity of a nation as Christian as such. We could think of the theonomic implications of wanting laws and the societal structure to be, Christian as such by name or by identification. But just back to what you said, it seems that the pushback is that it is incompatible, at least with Western evangelical Christianity, this thought of the nation itself identifying as Christian. That seems to be the big pushback. And I'm thinking through, we had the 9 Marks Journal, and I was just trying to pull it up and I couldn't find it. But you've had a lot of pushback that says the only thing that can be described as a Christian nation is the church, the people of God. To describe a nation, or for any nation to be Christian in any sort of identification sense. But the way you're describing it, that doesn't seem to be historically.
No, that's an egalitarian impulse. If you read Calvin or Augustine or anyone really prior to World War II, almost, maybe with the exception, I mean, there's some probably cults, and maybe the Anabaptists would also, some groups of theirs might fit into this. They might say similar things, because they didn't really, I mean, they were so separatist that some of them, as you know, the Amish, they didn't want any involvement. They didn't want to be even defending their country in a war, which of course with smaller populations is doable. If you have enough people saying, I'm not going to go to war, though, you don't have a nation anymore. It's going to be taken over and destroyed. So the Anabaptists were only able to really sustain that because of their small numbers. And it's weird that it's in Reformed circles. That is an oddity, in my opinion, because there's always been a distinction. Calvin talks about this, Luther talks about this, between the eternal realm and the temporal realm, and that your identity in the temporal realm and your identity in the eternal realm are two different things. It doesn't mean there's not any overlap. It just means that you're going to live forever after this life is over in heaven, in some ways your eternal life is never over. You're living it now, and you will continue to live it. But you're not going to inhabit the same all the same identities and positions and and have the same attachments that you do in this life.
Mm.
And so as soon as you recognize that, it becomes clear that to live in this world, you have to get along with your neighbor. You have to make sure that, you know, your children are educated and fed. You have to be able to navigate, you know, you have to navigate work situations where you might not agree with your boss or, you know, other coworkers. There's all these things that you have to navigate here in the real world. I mean, marriage is part of this temporal world. It's not in heaven,
Right.
according to Jesus, which my wife really hates, but it's
yeah.
You know,
don't derail our podcast topic, John.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that one. No, it's weird though, and not trying to interrupt you, but what you're saying, this seems to be one of the things that I find some cognitive, like either I'm missing it or it's not connecting, because you think of all the heavy lifting that we did coming out of 2020. Many pastors, myself included, were having to read some things we had not read, flex some muscles we had not previously exercised. So you're looking through things like sphere sovereignty, and you're seeing that there's different spheres of authority in this world, yet God is over all, Christ is over all these spheres of authority. So it seems that the natural outworking of that would be to recognize that a people can repent and claim their identity as Christian. And if you were to think to most evangelical churches, you could preach a very clear message that countries that rebel, statedly rebel against the King of the universe, they will suffer divine judgment and wrath. If a country rebels against God, that's not only a biblical theme, but I think most Christians would readily affirm that in our society, that if a country comes out and says, we as a people hate the God of the universe and we want to rebel against him, that God would be just to judge them. But then in the same breath, we would say that country cannot repent and turn to the Lord in any actual sense. And that just, I don't understand how to make that connection.
Yeah, I don't either.
Okay.
That's my answer. I mean, I don't really, I don't know what to say to that. It's ahistorical. It seems to me that it just serves the purpose of reinforcing a managerial elite guild that exists, and trying to show actual people in the world that we're not a threat to them. That was Russell Moore and David French's approach, right? To try to prove that all these deplorable Christians, that they're really not a threat, because look at me, I'm Russell Moore and I agree with you. And then they would try to signal to their base, stop it, cut it out, guys. You're freaking out the people, our overlords. So they took a posture of humility, or not. That's not of submission, really. They took a posture of submission to these kind of pagan overlords and said that that's our role, is to make sure that we can navigate our people through this. And, you know, that's the best construction, the best motivation I can put on this, is to say that might be why there's some people critiquing it. I mean, some of these guys, though, I mean, they're believers. They really think that this is racist. They really think that this is totalitarian. They really think it's going to threaten free speech if you outlaw pornography or something. They're firmly committed to an American classical liberalism of sorts. And so maybe that's the discussion that needs to take place. And it hasn't been as much as we've talked about social justice a lot since 2020, and how evangelicals fuse their beliefs with social justice. Maybe we need to start talking about classical liberalism, and how there's another group of evangelicals that seem to also be fusing their beliefs with some of these classical liberal ideas, like diversity is our strength, America is an idea, we're a melting pot, where these aren't things the founders believed, or, you know, nation of immigrants, if I didn't say that already, where you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. You know, that's very a classical liberal belief. We need religious neutrality. As long as you pledge allegiance to a certain creed, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, it's instant. You set foot on this soil and you just say, I believe in the American creed, equality and freedom. Basically, you're an American just as much as someone who's been here. Their family's been here hundreds of years. They fought in all the wars. They settled. It doesn't matter. You're just as much as an American as they are. And it doesn't take, it's an easy process. That's probably, this is all classical liberalism stuff, but I think it's been somewhat fused almost in a religious way with Christianity for some people. And you see it when you start talking about these outside the box political solutions. Maybe we should talk about secession. Maybe we need a Protestant Franco, maybe. And there's a certain class of evangelicals who just can't fathom that, like, America being changed somehow. Like, you know, we all think it should be 50 states and those are the borders, and it should just look this way, the way that it was when I grew up. And it's like, you're not living in reality though. Like reality is we're already coming apart, and do we want it to happen in a good way that Christians are ready for, or do we want it to happen in a way we're not ready for and we get totalitarianism? That's really the question.
So tell me this, John, because let me walk you into this question. The question I wanted to ask is what sort of, because you mentioned kind of a maybe a lack of interaction on this. I'm curious how you gauge the current interaction with these ideas, the willingness of these different camps to sit down at the table. But just to frame the question, one of the things we kind of circled around there a little bit, you mentioned sort of that two kingdom sort of paradigm, right? And you can spot differences in the way two kingdoms is expressed throughout different different iterations of it, right? But in general, I think that a lot of the damage that we're currently swirling around has been a radical bifurcation of a sacred and a secular kingdom. As if we live in a sacred realm, and yet it doesn't actually touch down with any sort of what we would reckon the common realm or that sort of thing, which I don't think is doing justice to a lot of the citations or those that are being sourced for that sort of view. But with that conversation, that sort of two kingdom, one kingdom conversation, you at least have dialogue, so you can follow some of the back and forth. There's articles being written. There's fierce disagreement, and yet at the same time, I'm able to pick up on engagement with one another's views. Are we seeing that with this? And if so, what, or if not, what's your take on maybe why or how we could forge a way ahead?
Yeah. I think Scott O'Neill just wrote a book, G3 guy who's critiqued Christian nationalism. And I think it's even called, the subtitle has something about two kingdoms. So some of these guys think that they are two kingdom. I suspect it's more of a radical two kingdom theology, which is to be separated. It's not the same as historic Protestant two kingdom theology. I think you can at this point make a firm distinction. The radical two kingdom stuff seems to almost be Anabaptist. It's that there should be no influence that the church, I guess, has in the political realm at all. It's not even to speak prophetically isn't even the church's job. You get weird stuff. Like I think R. Scott Clark, he's big on this. He even critiqued I think it was a vice governor or whatever the position is, second in command of the state of Oklahoma, wanted to dedicate the state to Jesus Christ. And he just said, basically, this is horrible. And I mean, he just went so far after it and aggressive after it. It was just embarrassing to me, but it's because of this R2K, like the two shall never be mixed kind of thing. And so that's not like standard two kingdom theology. Like what Calvin, what Augustine, what they believed was more just that this life that we're in now is a preparation for the heavenly life that awaits us. And the church has a focus on preparation for that heavenly life. The state has a different role in administering justice in this life. And so it doesn't mean that the church also isn't capable of interpreting the word of God and speaking prophetically to the state. It doesn't mean, though, that the role of the church isn't to run elections, though, and to be directly participating with the in the temporal world in such a way that they miss sight of the mission that they actually have, which is to prepare people for a heavenly kingdom. But the law has three uses, and so it's going to, if you're trying to give people a moral standard, it's going to have an impact. Especially if you have people coming to your church who are politicians. I mean, they need to know what the word of God says so they can rule. So yeah, there isn't a firm break between these two institutions. They have different functions. They have different roles. But yeah, I mean, there's a range with one kingdom and two kingdom. And I would say that it is a lot of R2K guys that are critiquing Christian nationalists, but it's also a lot of like one kingdom guys. You got like Andrew Sandlin and some of like the Ezra Institute guys really going hard against Christian nationalism. So, and it's funny because you think that they have these disagreements over here, but they also kind of spiritualize things. They kind of everything gets kind of collapsed, in my opinion, into like your heavenly identity becomes so preeminent that it's almost like your only identity, and that's the only thing you should care about. And it's like no. I mean, I have more in common with my next door neighbor than I do a Nigerian woman who's a Christian from somewhere else, even though my next door neighbor isn't saved. Yes, I have more spiritually in common with the Nigerian woman, but we don't speak the same language. We don't live in the same place. We don't have the same interests or concerns and threats and all the rest. So I'm going to have more in common with the person next door to me. And that shouldn't be controversial, but it is. It is now. The only thing you should think about it for the R2K and some of the One Kingdom guys, it seems like, is this this heavenly identity that you have. And so it prohibits. I mean, this is why, like, when Stephen Wolfe did his tweet, when he said that white evangelicals are the only bulwark or the sole bulwark against moral insanity, he was using political categories there from the temporal world, right? And people freaked out and thought he was saying that we're not all one in Christ, that and we're fundamentally unraveling the union we have in Christ at the communion table over ethnicity. And I was scratching my head, like, how did you get here? But that's the only way I can think of how people get there. They're conflating categories. They're seeing Stephen use an earthly temporal category, and then they're imposing upon him a meaning that he doesn't mean from an eternal category. And so as far as the dialogue goes, I think it's been pretty poor. I mean, I have personal experience with this, but I'm connected to a bunch of the guys who wear the label Christian nationalist, and I would say they've been treated fairly rudely. They've been dismissed when there has been any interaction in private. All the interactions I've heard of have been have gone sideways, and it's just sad to me. It's not, these things ought not to be, but they are. So.
No, it's interesting. You brought up the Stephen Wolfe tweet. I saw the tweet. I'd read the book to do the footwork, so I knew where he was coming from. I thought it was a bad tweet, but I still understood where he was coming from. So that's an interesting dynamic. What encouragement do you see right now, John? Where do you see some of this maybe having positive developments? Where are we gaining ground, maybe? Because with any of these disagreements, with any of these kerfuffles within theological thought, I would hope it would lead to greater clarity. I would hope at some point people would sit down at the table, hash through some of these terms so we can speak in clearer terms and maybe not speak past each other, or, even worse, tear a brother down unnecessarily. What do you see encouraging right now?
That's a good question. Well, as hopefully by the time this airs, which I assume is going to be later, since you said it'll be after the conference, there will be some encouraging news. Right now, I don't have a lot, like, especially right now as we're recording this. We're in the middle of a big controversy on Twitter. I mean, I don't mind saying who it is at this time. I don't know if the situation will have changed by the time that the podcast comes out, but Josh Bice yesterday was really going hard after Christian nationalists and trying to link them to a guy named Charles Hayward, and who believes in something called foundationalism, which is different. Hayward's he doesn't claim to be a Christian nationalist. I think he's Eastern Orthodox, if I'm not mistaken. But there's been, even right now, I'm sure if I go onto Twitter, I'm going to see like a war zone. And so that's kind of like the situation right now. I mean, I guess if there's any encouragement, it's that in the pews, at least, there are people that are realizing that some of these objections just they don't make sense. They're not rational. It's driving people to read Torba and Stephen and listen to guys like Joel Webbin and maybe even some of the Moscow guys, and so, like, the people who are in that kind of that vein are being now more read. And when people start actually honestly reading them, they are coming to conclusions. I know this for a fact that, hey, these critiques don't make any sense. What they're saying actually does make sense on some level, or at least if I don't agree with all of it, like, I understand where the person's coming from, and I'm not going to smear them as a horrible racist or a whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I do see some encouragement there. But yeah, when it comes to people who have like platforms, I've tried to give the olive branch as much as I can. I even called G3 Ministries yesterday and left a message, and I haven't received a call back at the time of this recording, but that's been my hope, is to try to create that common ground. I don't see it happening. There's only one side that seems interested in a dialogue.
Well, let's hope and pray that changes. John, where can people follow you? We mentioned the podcast. You're on Conversations That Matter podcast, but where can people keep up with you?
Yeah, johnharrispodcast.com is all my social media links. So if you go there, that'll have links to other things. I also am involved with Last Stand Studios and TruthScript. So truthscript.com, laststandstudios.org are other links.
Very good. All right. Well, John Harris, thank you so much for popping on, and yeah, hope to follow up with you with a more encouraging take on it, hopefully in the next couple of months.
Yeah, sorry to be a down, whatever I'm trying to say, a stick in the mud, a party pooper.
No, that's good.
But I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks, brother.
Yep.
Seated here at my right hand, the